After World War II, Hungary got to experience the joys of Soviet liberation, which is a bit like experiencing the joy of a home invasion. The country was run by a man named Mighties Rákosi, a charming fellow who proudly called himself Stalin's best pupil. This was less a boast and more a threat. His secret police, the VH, were spectacularly efficient, seeing potential traitors behind every goulash pot. For every 50 Hungarians, there was one informer. Rákosi built a cult of personality so intense he was probably jealous of his own portraits. Then, in 1953, the original Stalin had the audacity to die, creating a very awkward power vacuum and a period called the Thaw. It was a time when Moscow hinted that maybe, just maybe, terrorizing your entire population wasn't the only way to govern, a truly radical idea. By October 1956, university students in Budapest, filled with the dangerous combination of caffeine and ideas, decided they'd had enough. They drafted 16 points, a list of demands that included things like freedom of the press, free elections, and the polite request for Soviet troops to leave. On October 23rd, they marched. The Communist Party boss, Ern Gare, decided the best way to handle this was to go on the radio and deliver a speech. He proceeded to call the tens of thousands of protesters chauvinists, reactionaries, and enemies of the people. It was a masterclass in how to turn a peaceful protest into an armed insurrection. You could almost hear the entire city collectively decide, all right, fine, you want enemies? You've got them. He essentially dared them to get serious, and they happily obliged. The first thing to go after Ger's spectacular own goal of a speech was an enormous bronze statue of Stalin. It took hours, welding torches, and a lot of coordinated pulling. But eventually, the 30-foot monument to tyranny met the pavement. The only things left were his boots, which is a fittingly ridiculous end. As this was happening, the secret police made another brilliant decision. They fired on the unarmed crowd outside the radio station. Suddenly, the revolution had its first martyrs. The Hungarian army, when called in to restore order, sort of didn't. Soldiers either joined the protesters or just conveniently left weapons caches unguarded. Turns out, when you spend a decade oppressing people, their loyalty can be a bit fragile. Who knew? With the city in open revolt, the Soviets and the Hungarian Communist Party panicked and did what any failing organization does. They brought back a guy they'd previously fired. Enter Imre Nagy, a communist who had been pushed aside for not being Rákosi levels of brutal. He was seen as a reformer. On October 28th, Nagy announced a ceasefire and, incredibly, the Soviet tanks that had entered Budapest began to pull out. For a few glorious days, it looked like the impossible was happening. The VHA was disbanded, political prisoners were freed, and non-communist political parties started popping up like mushrooms after a rainstorm. There was a giddy, unbelievable sense of victory in the air. People were actually winning against the Soviet Union. And that, right there, should have been the first warning sign. The revolution was moving at a breakneck pace. One of the most symbolic moments was the release of Cardinal Joseph Mindszenty from house arrest. He'd been a prisoner of the regime for 8 years, a potent symbol of Catholic and anti-communist resistance. His freedom felt like a final nail in the coffin of the old order. Nagy's new coalition government included actual non-communists, a concept so foreign it was like discovering a new primary color. They were talking about a multi-party democracy, a free press, a future. Everyone was so caught up in the momentum, so sure they had won, that they forgot one tiny detail. They were still living next door to an empire that did not handle rejection well. They were celebrating a successful prison break while the warden was just outside, quietly reloading. As Hungary was having its moment of glorious, hopeful freedom, the rest of the world decided to have its own crisis. On October 29th, Israel invaded Egypt, followed shortly by Britain and France in a poorly planned drama known as the Suez Crisis. Suddenly, every major Western power was completely distracted by a squabble over a canal in the Middle East. U.S. President Eisenhower was furious, not with the Soviets, but with his own allies, Britain and France, for starting a mess without his permission. All the political oxygen in Washington, London, and Paris was sucked up by Suez. The timing couldn't have been worse for Budapest. It was like calling 911 during the Super Bowl of geopolitical disasters. Hungary's desperate plea for help just went straight to voicemail. While the West was busy yelling about Egypt, Imre Nagy made his final, fatal move. He was under immense pressure from the Hungarian people to go all the way. On November 1st, he announced that Hungary was withdrawing from the Warsaw Pact and declaring total neutrality, like Austria or Switzerland. This was the one thing Moscow could absolutely not tolerate. Allowing one country to just leave the club? That would give the others ideas. For Nikita Khrushchev, this transformed the situation from a manageable internal problem into an existential threat to the entire Soviet bloc. Nagy wasn't just asking for reforms anymore. He was trying to switch teams in the middle of the Cold War. The Soviets, who had been pretending to negotiate, stopped pretending. The decision was made. The hammer was coming down. Adding a layer of pure tragedy to the whole affair was the American-funded Radio Free Europe. Throughout the uprising, its broadcasts were, to put it mildly, unhelpful. They aired commentary that heavily implied Western support was not just a possibility, but an inevitability. They celebrated the rebels and talked about the free world's duty to help, using language that a desperate population could easily interpret as a promise of military aid. The Eisenhower administration had no intention of starting World War III over Hungary, but they never bothered to make that crystal clear in their propaganda. So, as Hungarian teenagers were getting ready to fight Soviet tanks with wine bottles full of gasoline, many of them genuinely believed American cavalry was just over the horizon. It was a brutal lesson in the difference between moral support and actual support. In the pre-dawn hours of November 4th, the Soviet response arrived. It was codenamed Operation Whirlwind, and it was anything but subtle. Over 1,000 tanks, some sources say up to 4,000, and tens of thousands of soldiers poured into Budapest and across the country. This wasn't the hesitant, confused force from the first intervention. This was a massive, coordinated invasion designed for one purpose: to crush the revolution completely. Soviet soldiers were told they were fighting fascists and CIA agents, which must have been very confusing when they were met by factory workers and students. Imre Nagy made one last heartbreaking broadcast to the nation and the world as the shells began to fall, announcing the invasion before taking refuge in the Yugoslavian embassy. The 2 weeks of freedom were officially over. What followed was several days of brutal, hopeless, and unbelievably courageous fighting. This wasn't an army fighting an army, it was a city. Ordinary Hungarians, nicknamed the Boys of Pest, fought back with whatever they had. They used hunting rifles, machine guns from the army, and their most famous weapon, the Molotov cocktail. It's a testament to their ingenuity and bravery that they managed to destroy or disable several hundred Soviet tanks. They would grease the streets with soap and cooking oil to make tanks slide, hang cables to decapitate commanders, and dash out to stick explosives on their tracks. But bravery doesn't stop artillery shells, and courage is no match for overwhelming firepower. It was a slaughter. The resistance was fierce, but the outcome was never in doubt. By mid-November, the fighting was over. The Soviets installed a new puppet leader, Janos Kadar, who had been part of Nagy's government before quietly defecting to the Soviet side. His first job was to oversee the brutal crackdown. Around 2,500 Hungarians were killed in the fighting, and another 20,000 were arrested afterwards. Imre Nagy was tricked into leaving the Yugoslav embassy with a promise of safe passage, only to be arrested, put on a secret trial, and executed in 1958. His fate was a clear, cold message to any other potential reformers in the Eastern Bloc. In the chaos, 200,000 Hungarians fled the country, a massive brain drain of anyone who could get out. The West, for its part, expressed deep concern, passed some strongly worded UN resolutions, and welcomed the refugees. Militarily, they did nothing. The Iron Curtain had been tested, and it held. The legacy of 1956 is complicated. Under Kadar, Hungary eventually entered a strange period known as goulash communism. The deal was simple. The state would provide a slightly better standard of living, more consumer goods, and a little more cultural freedom than elsewhere in the Eastern Bloc. In return, everyone had to agree to never, ever talk about politics or what happened in 1956. It was a collective bargain of political amnesia for a better car. The crushing of the Hungarian Revolution showed the world the brutal reality of Soviet power and the absolute hollowness of Western rhetoric about rolling back communism. It was a lesson written in blood on the streets of Budapest. In the Cold War, some nations were free and others were chess pieces. And nobody risks a nuclear war for a pawn. If you enjoyed this video, please like, comment, and subscribe to our channel for more historical insights. Thanks for watching, nerds!